Rock God is Stone Cold. The Hellraiser is back.
Here we go. Evolution of the Shield.
John Cena versus the Showstopper.
Hulk Hogan and The Rock in the same ring.
You will never take my place at the head of the table.
Undertaker with a Hell's Gate submission. Oh my God! What?
My God, Michaels just kicked Cena's head off.
The Monday Night Wars have come to WrestleMania.
It'll be The Rock. It'll be Austin one-on-one.
Third and five to the Undertaker.
Do you believe in miracles?
The streak is over.
Hey, what's going on, guys, and welcome back to Rivalries on the WWE podcast on this Friday, November 26th, as we are well on our way to the home stretch until the new year. And for all of my American listeners down there in the United States, I want to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. And I hope you guys all stuffed your faces with turkey and stuffing and all that fun stuff, pumpkin pie. And I'm sure you'll all commence your detox next week. And, you know, up here in Canada, we have our Thanksgiving at the beginning of October. And the week or two following is always a tough go to get things back on the healthy track, if for lack of better words. And regardless, I really hope that everyone enjoys their time with their family. Obviously, there was not much of a Thanksgiving last year because of COVID, and with the holidays around the corner, it's just a very, very happy time. And obviously, I was absent last week. Matt and I kind of took a bit of a break. You got from the Vault edition of Matt and I covering Austin versus McMahon. You got it from the Vault edition of the What If segment, actually. A solo show for Matt that he released 2.5 years ago, just about the time that I joined the podcast. So you're back with me in live format now. And this week we are going to be covering a rivalry that I actually got as a suggestion from DJ Kuzmo. And it would have been more appropriate if it was done last week. But it seems like it's just as appropriate now for Becky Lynch versus Charlotte Flair. And I guess it kind of did work out because we got the result to the match with Becky Lynch going over in their one-on-one contest at Survivor Series. And the thing about this rivalry is kind of similar to when I covered Brock versus Roman, is that I don't think this is over. Obviously, there are a lot of moving parts, and that would be true assuming all things stay equal. Like, if Charlotte Flair decides to walk away and go to AEW in a couple months, then yeah, then it very well may be over. But assuming all things remain equal and Charlotte Flair stays in WWE, you would have to assume that Becky Lynch and Charlotte will once again go head-to-head and collide in a major fashion. And, you know, their careers have run parallel for just about 6 years now. And I remember when they both showed up in the summer of 2015 during the Women's Revolution. And that was a time when the women on top of WWE were Paige and the Bella Twins, pretty much, because AJ Lee had just stepped away from the company following her tag team match at WrestleMania 31, tagging with Paige against the Bella Twins. So by the time the summer of 2015 came around and Nikki Bella had been the Divas champion for almost, I would say, 10 months or so by that point, and you had Team Bella, which comprised of Brie Bella and Alicia Fox running shotgun with her, it seemed like it was time for a changing of the guard in the women's division. And that's what prompted Stephanie McMahon to come to the ring and debut 3 new women, and one of which being Becky Lynch.
So you can stop running your mouth, because things are going to change, starting right now. Now, I want this revolution here in WWE. Paige wants this revolution, but Paige, courage can't do it by itself. It takes more than that. You need backup. And for some reason, nobody's been willing to stand by your side. But I know someone who is. I know someone who has had to scratch and claw and fight for everything that they've ever gotten. Somebody who's not afraid of the fire, somebody I would want in the foxhole with me. So joining Paige right now is Becky Lynch.
Oh boy. Ladies and gentlemen, if you watch NXT on the WWE Network, you're very familiar with this young lady, Becky Lynch. And Byron, you're one of the voices of NXT. Becky Lynch has set that division on fire.
One of the trailblazers of the Divas division on NXT, one of the most energized Divas you will find. She is fun to watch.
So Becky Lynch was the first bombshell to drop by Stephanie McMahon at that time, and as she alluded to, is that Becky Lynch would be coming into WWE to fight alongside Paige against Team Bella, which was kind of like a 3-on-1 capacity and had been that for quite a while. But that wasn't just the only bombshell that Stephanie McMahon would drop. She had another ally in mind to back up Paige and fight alongside Becky Lynch.
And profiling someone who says she is genetically superior, ladies and gentlemen, Charlotte!
And you hear the whoos that has become this young lady is the daughter of the two-time WWE Hall of Famer, the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. And Byron, one of the most dominant divas we've ever seen at NXT.
Yeah, former NXT Women's Champion and one of the most athletically gifted women you will ever see step inside a ring.
John, Stephanie is shaking things up. You think?
So just like that, you have an injection of youth and what would ultimately become major star power into the women's division. And, I think it's worth noting that Sasha Banks also made her debut on this very night, and she aligned herself with Naomi and Tamina to form a faction that was referred to as Team Bad. So for the succeeding few months here, you had Team Bella, which was the Bella Twins and Alicia Fox. Team, I believe it was PCB, that's what they went by, of Paige, Charlotte, and Becky. And then Team Bad of Sasha, Tamina, and Naomi. And it was a really good way, I think, to break in all three of Sasha, Charlotte, and Becky. Specifically, I would say at the time was Charlotte. It was obvious that Charlotte was kind of like the crown jewel of the three. And I mean, fast forward 6 years, you can make the case that those three are the three faces of the women's division, probably alongside Bianca Belair and Bayley whenever she is scheduled to return. So focusing in on Becky and Charlotte here, they were tagging and in a team for several months at this point. But sooner rather than later, right around the winter of 2016, Charlotte broke away and actually defeated Nikki Bella for the Divas Championship. And this was kind of like the dawn of a new era in the women's division, because Nikki Bella, although maybe not fair to completely group her in with the Divas era, with like the Ava Marie's and the Eve Torreses of the world, and I guess even not so much AJ Lee, but she was kind of around in that time, although she was much ahead of her time. She belonged in the current women's division that we see nowadays. It was kind of a changing of the guard when Charlotte defeated Nikki Bella for the Divas Championship, because now it was like officially that the torch was being passed and Stephanie McMahon's words were officially coming to fruition. And a few words on Stephanie McMahon. I don't know if you guys watched the new season of Ruthless Aggression, but they have an episode dedicated to the first Revolution. Now, I think that they kind of exaggerated a bit. I watched the Ruthless Aggression live when I was younger, and I've watched it a bunch of times over in recent years on the WWE Network. And to say that it was the first Revolution, I think is a little bit of a stretch, because you still had bra and panties matches, cat fights, Playboy pillow fights, all this stuff, swimsuit competitions. Like, there was still a lot of objectifying of women going on in the Ruthless Aggression era. But that being said, Stephanie McMahon becoming the on-screen SmackDown general manager did help improve the women's division from where it was at in the Attitude Era. Because in the Attitude Era, it was just a complete joke, I'll be frank. It was as if it shouldn't even have been a division. It was a sideshow. It was a bathroom break, something to go get popcorn if you were in the arena. But at least when you got to Ruthless Aggression, and they really mapped out the timeline of Victoria versus Trish during that point, you really at least started to get some actual stories involved. And obviously one of the greatest, if not the greatest women's rivalry of all time, Lita versus Trish. One that I really will cover one day. Maybe I'll bring Matt on for that major rivalry. But I think it was kind of spearheaded by Stephanie McMahon holding that very prominent role on screen as the SmackDown general manager. And obviously she was only in that role for about a calendar year, and then she was off of television right up until 08 or 09. So, I mean, her impact was not nearly as significant as it was in 2015, but it was just another common denominator in Stephanie McMahon that always kind of seems to be at the center every time the women have a breakthrough in the wrestling industry, at least in WWE. And, you know, for all that, like, Stephanie McMahon probably does harm to the business, you know, trying to distance herself from being a wrestling company and so focused on the brand and kind of making the product suffer in as a result of that, I think what she's done for the women, both, let's say, 15, 16 years ago, and what she's doing now and started back in 2015 is very commendable and something that I don't think would have happened had she not fast-tracked it. And her coming out and being a prominent figure as the authority figure during this time, but also having real pull backstage. Because I believe in the Ruthless Aggression era, Stephanie McMahon was not entirely involved in creative and backstage string pulling, if you will. Maybe string pulling is not the correct term, but you know what I mean. I believe she was a producer in some capacity, but certainly not to the level that she is and has been in the 2010s and continues to have nowadays. But getting back on track here with Becky versus Charlotte, they were involved in the triple threat match at WrestleMania 32, also including Sasha Banks, for the Women's Championship. And this would be the official transition from the Divas title to what we now know as the Raw Women's Championship. Charlotte ultimately ends up going over and debuts the new World Championship for the women. And in 2016, the summer, we have the brand split come back into effect. And this is what really split these two off for a number of years. Because you had Charlotte go to Raw with Sasha Banks and eventually Bayley as well. And you have Becky Lynch go over to SmackDown. And SmackDown kind of became Becky Lynch's home for a number of years. And right out of the gate, she was kind of the face of the SmackDown women's division. She was the first ever SmackDown women's champion. And that was a division, you know, upon the new era of the brand split on SmackDown Live, that wasn't very strong. You had Becky Lynch, and then you had rookies in Carmella and Alexa Bliss. You had Naomi, who eventually fast-tracked her way up the card, but upon the start of this new era of SmackDown, she wasn't really much of anything. She had just turned babyface. I think Natalya was on that brand as well. So Becky Lynch, right out of the gate, became the champion and was the face of that brand. But it didn't take too long for them to pull the plug there, and they kind of pulled an audible, what it seemed like, and gave the championship to a relatively new face in Alexa Bliss. And Alexa really became the face of SmackDown, of the SmackDown women's division, almost right away. And it kind of felt like they did it at the expense of Becky Lynch, because I thought Becky Lynch was over all the way back in 2016, but you never got the feeling that WWE felt the same way. And when they transitioned the belt to Alexa Bliss, and I believe she won it at the first ever SmackDown exclusive pay-per-view in Backlash, at Backlash in September of 2016, the first pay-per-view following SummerSlam. It kind of felt like, okay, they really are not that high on Becky Lynch. And Alexa really carried that belt almost right up until WrestleMania. Naomi won it at, I believe, the Elimination Chamber, but then had to drop it straight away because of an injury, and then re-picked it back up from Alexa Bliss once again at WrestleMania 33. And following WrestleMania 33, there was the Superstar Shakeup. And this was when we got a real shift in the women's division, specifically on SmackDown.
I guess from the sound of it, you guys were thinking I was going to say somebody else. Perhaps the greatest acquisition of the Superstar Shakeup and the newest member of the SmackDown Live Women's Division. I give to you, Charlotte! Queen is here!
Oh my goodness! You talk about raising the stock in your women's division.
A four-time Raw Women's Champion, Charlotte, genetically superior. Shane said it right, perhaps the biggest acquisition in the Superstar Shakeup.
And what was funny about this clip was that Shane McMahon, before introducing Charlotte, was introducing a woman whose father was one of the greatest of all time, is a Hall of Famer, and then out comes Tamina, because, you know, she's the daughter of Jimmy Superfly Snuka, and, you know, I feel bad, but Tamina is probably easily the most dislikable woman on the roster, and has been since she showed up. I don't think her character has ever caught on. I don't think she really knows what her character is supposed to be. I think she's a terrible worker. And I just found it kind of funny in a bad way that they kind of used her as a pawn to deflate the audience before eventually giving them what they wanted in Charlotte Flair. Because that's what they were angling towards. And this is basically when Becky Lynch got completely thrown down the card. Because she hadn't been champ for right about 6 months at this point. And Naomi, the new babyface champion on SmackDown, you have someone in Natalya who they were still kind of itching to give another run. She eventually did get a run with the SmackDown Women's Championship. And now you bring over Charlotte Flair, who was fresh off of just about a year trading the Raw Women's Championship on and off with Sasha Banks. They had a really good rivalry in 2016 at WrestleMania 33, an incredible fatal four-way match for the Raw Women's Championship with Charlotte, Sasha, Bayley, and Nia Jax. I believe Bayley came out on top on that one. And now you're throwing her over on the SmackDown, and you knew that Charlotte was coming over here to be the face. And just how Shane McMahon introduced her, it was branded as the greatest acquisition of the draft, of the Superstar Shakeup. And based on the other, names who moved, even on the men's side, you could really make that case for it. And it kind of told you what they thought of Charlotte. And what was crazy is Becky was in the ring when Charlotte was drafted to SmackDown. And it was just crazy that she was kind of just lost in the crowd with the likes of Carmella, with the likes of Natalya, with the likes of now Tamina on the SmackDown women's roster. So you really had Becky for the entirety of 2016 just kind of withering away in obscurity. She really played no major role in the SmackDown women's division for that entire year, while Charlotte skyrocketed up the ranks. And you had eventually Charlotte get into a pretty nice rivalry with Natalya. She becomes the SmackDown Women's Champion. Then you have Asuka win the first ever Women's Royal Rumble. Goes on to have an incredible wrestling match with Charlotte at WrestleMania 34 in 2018. And that is kind of when you had Charlotte get cemented as kind of like the top of the food chain, bar none, when she breaks Asuka's undefeated streak at WrestleMania 34. And in this time is when I believe Becky Lynch was actually on the shelf with injury. And in 2018, following WrestleMania, you kind of get you start to get the sense of it that people were getting a bit sick of Charlotte. She was a babyface at this point, and drops the belt, the championship rather, directly after WrestleMania to Carmella, who cashed in her Money in the Bank briefcase. And Carmella held that championship all the way until SummerSlam. So she had a pretty nice run with the SmackDown Women's title. One I hope she eventually gets again. Nice to see her get some gold, becoming the tag team champs with Queen Zelina. Just a side note there. And when Becky Lynch returned, she became the #1 contender for the SmackDown Women's Championship. But a few weeks later, Charlotte plays herself into the equation to make it a triple threat match at SummerSlam 2018 for the SmackDown Women's Championship. And you could feel that the seeds were being planted, and the fans were really behind Becky. And we all know what the ultimate outcome is that we get the most failed heel turns in the history of heel turns at SummerSlam 2018 with Becky Lynch. And why was it the most failed heel turn of all time? Because the fans wanted Becky. They had it with Charlotte at this point. So when Charlotte wins the championship at SummerSlam 2018 and then proceeds to, embrace with Becky, and Becky turns on her and beats the holy hell out of her, the fans go ballistic and cheering her till they were blue in the face. And this is when you really had the Becky-Charlotte rivalry take off. Because up until this point, they really had not been on an equal plane or even involved with one another for several reasons. For one was on Raw and one was on SmackDown when they started the brand split in 2016. Then when Charlotte came over, you had Charlotte at the top of the food chain and Becky all the way down the card. And, it's tough to say a mid-carder in the women's division because there only are maximum 10 women on each show at any given point. But Becky was not a big factor in the world championship picture on the women's side. So you had Charlotte at one level, Becky at another, and then Becky gets hurt. So these two had really not been involved with another in any serious capacity for 2.5 years since that WrestleMania match at WrestleMania 32 involving Sasha Banks. So when Becky finally kind of got put on the same stage as Charlotte, the fans wanted Becky, because I don't think that the support for Becky ever wavered, but just for one reason or another, the WWE creative had no intentions on pulling, on pulling the trigger of making Becky Lynch the star of SmackDown, making her the face of that division. They did it early on in the brand split, but 2 years had gone by without her holding a title. They went with Alexa Bliss, they went with Naomi, and now they had been going with Charlotte, and in the recent part of it, also Carmella. But it's just crazy to think about that from September 2016 all the way until the late summer, fall of 2018 is what it took for Becky to get back into that serious contenders spot. And look, she had other championship matches along the way. She was involved in the Elimination Chamber. She had a few matches with Alexa Bliss. I think she was also part of the SmackDown Women's title match at WrestleMania 33, which was, I believe it was like a gauntlet match of some capacity. But for her to ever legitimately get back to this point in a serious capacity, a 24-month span, which is crazy to think about. And then when they do get her back there, they do it in the wrong way. They try and make her a heel, which the fans wanted no part of. They were sick of Charlotte. Charlotte had been in this prominent role for over 2 years at this point, and a large portion of that primarily on SmackDown as a babyface. They didn't want a babyface Charlotte to continue leading the SmackDown brand or the women's division as a whole. So this ultimately leads to a one-on-one match between the two at Hell in a Cell 2018, where the fans would finally, at long last, after a long 24 plus months, get what they want.
Charlotte so close to the ropes. Becky Lynch, can she win the title here? Look at Charlotte. Gets underneath the rope.
Becky's got to break it.
And the officials count of 5. Becky breaks it 4.
Becky knows the rules very well. Not going to get herself disqualified, but that was an extra 4 seconds. Charlotte Flair was forced to stay in the disarmer submission.
And Becky is not relenting. Back inside the ring after the champion. And with a one good arm, the champ fends off Becky.
Oh, they made it from the queen of Becky Lynch.
Turn around. Becky Lynch has won the title.
Here is your winner, and the new SmackDown Women's Champion, Becky Lynch.
A friendship left in the dust. All for that. The SmackDown Women's Championship.
Becky Lynch can look herself in the mirror and say it was all worthwhile.
Becky wanted to abandon the image of being a sidekick, the image of being in Charlotte's shadow, and now Becky Lynch has gotten her wish. She is indeed the new SmackDown Live Women's Champion.
On this night in San Antonio, Texas, the Irish last kicker has finally eclipsed the Queen.
And Charlotte's got to be in absolute disbelief right now watching Becky Lynch celebrate.
And what an incredible match. Kudos to both of these superstars, both of these women. It was a hard-fought battle for the right to reign supreme on SmackDown Live. But tonight, Becky Lynch was the better woman.
Almost ironic. It was Becky Lynch who had to watch Charlotte celebrate winning the Women's Championship at SummerSlam, and now the roles have been reversed.
So at long last, you get Becky Lynch defeat Charlotte Flair for the SmackDown Women's Championship and really usher in a new era, not just on the SmackDown Women's division, but in the women's division as a whole. Because as we know, between October of 2018 and April of 2019, Becky Lynch would go on a meteoric rise to the top of the WWE in total. Like, not just Raw, not just SmackDown, not just women, totally. She took over the WWE, and she was the most relevant storyline in the WWE at this point. More relevant than Seth Rollins becoming the Beast Slayer and defeating Brock Lesnar. More relevant than Kofi Mania. God, more relevant than Kofi Mania. More relevant than anything The Undertaker was doing at this point. He didn't even fight at that WrestleMania. But Becky Lynch took over WWE on the heels of defeating Charlotte Flair for the SmackDown Women's Championship. Now, along the way, she dropped it at TLC. She lost her rematch against Asuka at the Royal Rumble. She won that Royal Rumble, goes on to defeat Ronda and Charlotte at WrestleMania 35 in the main event, and would hold that belt for a calendar year until she actually relinquished it. What was it, in April or May of 2020, right in peak of, right at the beginning of COVID, rather. And they would not cross paths up until this past spring, or not this past spring, this past fall. en route to their clash at Survivor Series, which Becky Lynch would win again just a few days ago. And you kind of had these two have their rivalry go dormant for just about 2.5 years, because in 2019 Charlotte stayed on SmackDown, Becky Lynch stayed on Raw, and then when Charlotte eventually came back to Raw, Becky Lynch was on maternity leave. And then Becky Lynch comes back while Charlotte's on Raw, she returns to SmackDown, and then once again they swap brands. And they have their clash at Survivor Series. Becky Lynch gets the one-up again. And at this point, it's all Becky Lynch in this rivalry. Like, sure, Charlotte defeated her, in 2016 in a triple threat match at WrestleMania 32. But that match is so long ago that it doesn't even really feel relevant anymore. There was only one women's championship at that time. The women's division was a shade of what it is now. But in the more recent history of these two colliding, it's been all Becky Lynch all the time. In one-on-one matches, I don't think Charlotte's ever gotten the best of Becky Lynch in a major pay-per-view match capacity. And then at the triple threat match at WrestleMania 35, Becky Lynch took that historic win as well. Although it included Ronda Rousey, but that was arguably the biggest and most hyped up women's match in the history of the industry. And then in their most recent contest, Becky Lynch gets the victory once again by hook or crook, but a victory nonetheless. So I'm not a betting man, but I would assume that these two would collide one more time at some point. Again, assuming if Charlotte stays in the company. But the next time they collide, you would have to assume that Charlotte would get the W, just because in recent memory, recent matches, she has just been firing blanks against Becky Lynch. And I know that Becky Lynch is arguably the biggest star of the women's division, but at the end of the day, the legacy that Charlotte Flair comes with, and I'm not even talking about her being Ric Flair's son, just what she's done for that division, and in my opinion, the best women worker in the ring, bar none. Maybe Bianca Belair has something to say about that, but at this point, I would still give the nod to Charlotte. I think that if they do collide again, the next victory will belong to Charlotte Flair. Anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed a very recent rivalry in Becky versus Charlotte. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at ADeMarco25. You can follow Matt on Twitter at wrestling_audio, or you can email him at realwwepodcast@gmail.com. Anyway, guys, stay safe out there. Happy Thanksgiving, and I'll talk to you next week.